It was a crisp morning in Atlanta when Rebecca Turner, a seasoned federal prosecutor, left her apartment ready to face a simple parking ticket dispute. She had no idea that a brief, routine visit to the courthouse would soon expose deep-rooted biases and set off a chain of events that would challenge the very fabric of the justice system she served. What unfolded that day would change everything. Stay tuned to hear this powerful story of courage and justice. If you're listening, drop a comment with your city and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Rebecca Turner's morning began as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the blinds of her small but elegant downtown Atlanta apartment. The room, meticulously organized with books neatly stacked and case files arranged in perfect order, reflected her disciplined nature. Rebecca, 35 years old and a seasoned federal prosecutor, was known for her sharp mind and unwavering dedication. The early alarm at 6:30 a.m. was a mere formality. She was already awake, preparing mentally for the day ahead. Today, however, was supposed to be simpler, a personal errand involving a disputed parking ticket at the municipal court. She picked out her outfit, opting for a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse and tailored black pants. In the mirror, her determined brown eyes met her reflection, framed by natural curls she had recently embraced. They spoke of resilience, honed from years of facing courtroom challenges and overcoming professional biases. Rebecca moved through her morning routine with practiced precision. The aroma of fresh coffee filled her kitchen as she grabbed a banana from the counter. Her mind flicked between the case files and the documentation for her court appearance. "Just a quick trip, and I'll be back to work in no time," she reassured herself, tucking her court documents into a slim leather folder. The sudden buzz of her phone shattered the morning's calm, vibrating insistently against the polished counter. The display read, "Charles Bennett, U.S. Attorney's Office." A direct call from her boss at this hour was rare, and Rebecca's pulse quickened as she picked up. "Good morning, Charles," she greeted, keeping her tone steady despite the flurry of thoughts racing through her mind. "Morning, Rebecca. Sorry for the early interruption, but we've got an issue with the Peterson trafficking case. The defense just filed a motion that could derail our entire argument. It needs immediate attention." The gravity of the request sunk in. The Peterson case was monumental, one of the largest human trafficking cases in recent state history, and its outcome held implications for dozens of lives. Rebecca took a steadying breath, eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. It was only 7:15 a.m. There was time, but barely. "I understand. I'll start reviewing it as soon as possible," she replied, shifting into professional mode. The balance between her duties and personal time was always delicate, and today that line was blurring quickly. Setting her coffee down, Rebecca powered up her laptop and scanned the incoming documents. The legal arguments were complex, and her eyes scanned for weak points to counter. She jotted down a few notes, time slipping by unnoticed as her focus sharpened. At 8:15 a.m., she pushed back from the desk, the weight of the morning's work pressing on her. She had to leave now or risk being late for court. She slid her files into her bag, took a last sip of coffee, and stepped out into the cool morning air, unknowing that today would test not just her professional acumen, but her resilience against injustice itself. Rebecca navigated the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta, her car weaving through early morning traffic. The usual hum of NPR played faintly in the background, but today she barely registered the familiar voices. Her mind was occupied, replaying the arguments in the Peterson case she had just reviewed. The stakes were high, and the pressure of her dual responsibilities pressed down heavily. She clenched the steering wheel, her professional instincts urging her to stay focused, despite the time crunch. The municipal court appearance was supposed to be a minor inconvenience, but the urgency of the Peterson case added an edge to her morning. She glanced at the dashboard clock, 8:45 a.m. The court was only a few minutes away, but finding parking at this hour could be a challenge. Her phone buzzed with a thank you text from Charles, her boss, acknowledging her preliminary review. Rebecca exhaled a small sigh of relief, but her sense of urgency didn't wane. Finally, she spotted an open space in a crowded lot. Maneuvering quickly, she parked and gathered her things. The sounds of city life surrounded her, the honking of car horns, the steady rumble of engines, and the chatter of pedestrians. Adjusting her blazer and taking one last calming breath, she made her way to the courthouse entrance, mentally rehearsing her case for the disputed ticket. Little did she know, today's events would turn out to be far more consequential than a simple errand. The municipal courthouse stood as an imposing building of stone and glass, its grand facade a testament to tradition and authority. Rebecca stepped through the heavy doors, immediately met by a flurry of activity. The wide lobby buzzed with voices, shuffling papers, and the rhythmic clack of heels against marble floors. Lines of people formed before security checkpoints, each person clutching their own concerns, traffic tickets, small disputes, minor infractions. Rebecca's eyes scanned the room, noting the mix of anxious faces and hurried movements. She passed through security and entered the courtroom designated for her hearing. It was already busy. Every seat on the wooden benches was occupied. Some people whispered nervously while others sat with a resigned calm, waiting for their names to be called. The air was thick with the collective tension of a room full of people hoping for leniency. At the front, presiding over the morning's proceedings, sat Judge Richard Harris. His reputation preceded him, fair but unwaveringly strict. He was a tall man with a thin frame, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and a greying moustache that added an air of severity. At 62, Judge Harris had spent over 3 decades behind the bench, developing a reputation for punctuality and decorum. To him, lateness was a sign of disrespect, and courtroom efficiency was a point of pride. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice cut through the room, snapping conversations into silence. The crowd stood as Judge Harris entered, his black robe flowing as he took his seat. The room settled, and the day's proceedings commenced with an air of practiced formality. Rebecca, still standing near the back, glanced at her watch. 9:10 a.m. She was late. As she moved toward the front, the judge's eyes locked onto her, narrowing slightly. The room seemed to hold its breath. Rebecca maintained her composure, holding her head high and her posture confident. She had been in countless courtrooms, faced hardened defense attorneys, and argued before formidable judges, but today felt different. The stakes were personal, not just professional. Judge Harris interrupted the case he was addressing, directing his attention toward Rebecca. The pause in his voice was enough to draw the eyes of every person in the room to her. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and cold. The small murmurs that had begun in the back of the room ceased immediately. Rebecca's heartbeat quickened as she walked to the podium. She could feel the weight of every gaze, each filled with curiosity or judgment. She stood there, waiting, while Judge Harris shuffled papers on his desk without looking up. "You must be Ms. Turner, scheduled for the 9 a.m. hearing," he stated, emphasizing the time with a tone that dripped disapproval. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's, Ms. Turner?" Rebecca met his eyes evenly. The silent room amplified the tension, the unspoken question hanging in the air. How would she respond? The scene marked the beginning of what would soon expose much more than a simple case of tardiness, touching on themes of power, perception, and the biases that even the most experienced figures in the system might harbor. Rebecca stood at the podium, the room around her tense with a silence that buzzed. Judge Harris, seated high above the room with his thin-framed glasses glinting under the courtroom lights, fixed his gaze on her. The air felt charged, heavy with expectation. He leaned forward slightly, his robe barely rustling. "Ms. Turner," Judge Harris began, his voice cold and clipped. This court session began at 9 a.m. sharp. It's now past that. Do you care to explain why you deemed it acceptable to arrive late? Each word was a chisel meant to chip away at her composure. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, maintaining eye contact. Your Honor, I apologize for my delay. An urgent matter at the U.S. Attorney's office required my immediate attention. Judge Harris raised a hand, cutting her off. I have heard every excuse from traffic to personal emergencies, Ms. Turner. This court is no exception to the rule of law and order. Your position does not grant you special treatment. A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom. Some of the attendees exchanged glances, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and unease. Rebecca took a deep breath, her mind racing yet anchored by years of experience. She chose her words carefully. Understood, Your Honor. I only ask that you take into consideration. I do not consider tardiness, Ms. Turner. In this courtroom, it's a sign of disrespect. I will be issuing a fine for contempt. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still locked on her, as if daring her to react. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the judge's ruling landing like a stone in a pond, sending ripples through the room. An older black man seated near the back, James Wilson, the bailiff, felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this play out before, a harshness reserved for some, a leniency given to others. Nearby, a young white woman in a crisp suit who had also arrived late glanced at her watch nervously, realizing her own tardiness had been ignored. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushing as she noticed the disparate treatment. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, an older woman with soft eyes and years of experience, paused her typing and looked up, her fingers hesitating over the keys. She had watched Judge Harris for many years, seen his mannerisms and judgments, but today there was an edge that made her uncomfortable. Rebecca noticed the subtle shifts around her, the fleeting looks, the whispers barely audible. It wasn't just her imagination. The room felt it too. The air was thick with unspoken recognition, the kind that binds strangers in shared acknowledgement. Judge Harris's gavel tapped once, a percussive signal that the matter was closed in his mind. This court will not be delayed further. We will proceed with the next case, he declared. But Rebecca wasn't done. Not yet. Steadying herself, Rebecca took a deep breath and spoke, her voice clear yet measured. Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to formally introduce myself for the record. The judge's eyes narrowed. We know who you are, Ms. Turner. Let's not prolong this any further. Ignoring the dismissive tone, Rebecca opened her leather folder and held up her badge, the gold emblem catching the light. I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Turner, serving in the Northern District of Georgia. The reaction was immediate and palpable. A murmur rolled through the courtroom like distant thunder, quickly hushed but undeniable. Judge Harris's expression faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered, eyes now guarded and calculating. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Assistant U.S. Attorney? He echoed, his voice losing some of its edge. Yes, Your Honor, Rebecca continued, her tone unwavering. I was late this morning because I was reviewing urgent documents related to the Peterson trafficking case, which I'm sure you are aware has significant implications for this city. The courtroom clerk, Mrs. Thompson, resumed typing, but now with a fervor that bordered on anxiety. James Wilson, still standing by the entrance, allowed a small, knowing smile to tug at his lips. This was a moment he had waited to see. Someone standing up, pointing out what many chose to ignore. Judge Harris cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. Had I known your position, Ms. Turner, perhaps— Rebecca raised a hand, stopping him gently but firmly. Your Honor, my position should not matter. What should matter is the consistency and fairness of this court. Today, I witnessed differential treatment, and I believe it is my duty, as an officer of the law, to speak to it." The young woman who had arrived late earlier shifted again, this time sinking lower in her seat. Her eyes darted nervously as the reality of the moment sank in. The older man, James, nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and emotion. Judge Harris opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly struggling to regain control of the situation. "Ms. Turner, this is highly irregular. I suggest we—" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Rebecca said, each word resonating with quiet strength. "It's more than a suggestion. I will comply with your ruling, pay the fine, and document this proceeding. But know that I am also obligated to report any observations of inconsistent treatment to the Judicial Oversight Committee." A hush fell over the courtroom, deeper and more profound than before. Mrs. Thompson's fingers froze over the keyboard as if waiting for the air itself to move. Judge Harris's face, once stern and unyielding, now looked pale, the weight of realization settling on him. He shifted his gaze from Rebecca to the faces in the room. Witnesses now, not just attendees. I see," he stammered, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "Let us proceed." But everyone knew that nothing would proceed quite the same way again. The air in the courtroom grew electric as Rebecca Turner held her badge aloft, its golden federal seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Silence swept over the room, washing away whispers and side glances. Every eye was fixed on her, and even the subtle creak of the old wooden benches seemed to pause. Judge Harris's face froze, his brows knitting tightly as he registered what this meant. "I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Turner," she repeated, her voice clear and confident. "Serving in the Northern District of Georgia." The weight of her declaration hung heavy in the room, making even the hum of the ceiling fans feel louder than before. For a moment, the courtroom felt like a stage, with every person a witness to the unexpected shift in power dynamics. The young law student in the back straightened, wide-eyed as she realized the importance of what she was witnessing. James Wilson, the bailiff, exchanged a glance with Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, whose fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to keep typing or wait for what would come next. Judge Harris swallowed, the flush that had colored his face moments before now fading. His fingers fumbled with the papers on his desk, an attempt to project control that felt hollow. He adjusted his glasses, leaning forward to scrutinize Rebecca with newfound attention. The realization of who stood before him seemed to drain the room of its previous imbalance. The sudden shift in the courtroom's atmosphere was palpable. The judge's stern demeanor wavered, his eyes shifting from steely authority to guarded apprehension. He cleared his throat, a gesture that betrayed his unease. "Had I known your position, Ms. Turner—" Rebecca's steady gaze did not waver. "Your Honor, as I mentioned, my position should not be relevant. Justice should be impartial, should it not?" The courtroom was now so quiet that the slight rustle of fabric as people shifted was almost startling. The elderly black man in the gallery sat straighter, a faint smile of recognition breaking across his face. This was not just another morning in court. This was a reckoning he had long wished to see. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her expression was one of focused astonishment. She captured each word with careful precision, knowing this transcript would soon become more than routine paperwork. It would be a record of a moment that might echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. A young man seated near the front leaned over to whisper to his companion, "Did you see the look on his face? He didn't see that coming?" His companion nodded, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Judge Harris shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His gaze darted to the court clerk, then to the bailiff, before settling back on Rebecca. "Ms. Turner, this court recognizes the importance of your work and regrets any misunderstanding that may have occurred today. Rebecca's lips curved into a polite, tight smile. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the acknowledgement, but the issue at hand extends beyond misunderstandings. This morning, several individuals entered this courtroom after the 9 a.m. start time. Only some of us were called out and fined. Gasps rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable. The young woman who had also arrived late earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat, eyes darting from Rebecca to the judge. Her cheeks flushed with the realization that she had escaped notice while Rebecca had been made an example of. Judge Harris's composure fractured further, the thin veneer of control slipping. I assure you, Ms. Turner, this court strives to uphold fairness. With respect, Your Honor, Rebecca interjected, her tone remaining professional yet firm. Observations from this morning indicate otherwise. As an officer of the court, I am obligated to ensure that justice is applied equally and without prejudice. James Wilson, the bailiff, felt a swell of pride. He had seen countless cases where similar biases had played out unnoticed or ignored. Today, someone with both the position and the courage to call it out had stepped forward. The courtroom murmurs began to rise, a low tide of agreement, surprise, and approval. Mrs. Thompson's typing quickened, each key strike a marker of history in the making. The energy in the room shifted from tense silence to a quiet rumble of shared understanding. Judge Harris's face had turned pale, and he pressed his lips together, realizing that any attempt to smooth over this situation would only make it worse. The authority he had wielded effortlessly moments before now felt tenuous, his once commanding tone now uncertain. Rebecca turned slightly to address the entire courtroom, her eyes meeting those of people she did not know, but who seemed invested in this moment. Justice, she said, letting the word hang, is not just about enforcing laws, but about how those laws are applied. Today I will pay my fine as issued, not because it is just, but because it will serve as evidence of a system that can do better. The courtroom seemed to breathe as one, a shared release of tension that signaled something more profound than a simple ruling. This was a turning point, an acknowledgement that fairness had been challenged and would be scrutinized. Judge Harris's gaze fell to his desk, the silence around him now a testament to the shift in power. He knew that beyond this room, beyond today, change was coming. The silence in the courtroom, heavy and profound, was broken only by the faint tapping of Mrs. Thompson's keyboard as she typed furiously, documenting every word of Rebecca's powerful declaration. Judge Harris sat back, visibly rattled as Rebecca continued. Your Honor, she said, eyes steady and voice unwavering, I respectfully decline any dismissal of the fine. This matter is not about my title, but about ensuring consistent application of justice. I request an official review of today's proceedings and similar past cases for signs of unequal treatment. Gasps rippled through the gallery as attendees processed her words. This was more than a courtroom challenge. It was a call to action. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood a little taller, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He had witnessed countless scenes of quiet injustice, and today felt different. Judge Harris's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the papers on his desk. Ms. Turner, I will take your concerns under advisement, he said, though the hollow formality of his tone betrayed the turbulence beneath. Rebecca nodded curtly. Thank you, Your Honor. I will ensure my office submits a formal request to initiate an investigation. The declaration sealed her commitment, marking the start of what she knew would be a long but necessary process. By mid-afternoon, the story had spread beyond the courthouse walls. Word of the morning's confrontation traveled quickly through the legal community, whispered first in hallways and break rooms, then discussed openly in offices and public spaces. A young law student who had been present tweeted, "Today I saw true courage in court. A federal prosecutor called out systemic bias, and it was unforgettable." The post gained traction, retweeted by local attorneys and journalists, turning the incident into a viral moment. Rebecca's colleagues reached out with messages of support. "I've been in that courtroom and seen the same double standards," one message read. Another said, "Thank you for speaking up for all of us who've experienced it, but couldn't risk our careers." Each word fueled Rebecca's resolve, solidifying her belief that what happened that morning was more than a singular event. It was a microcosm of a much larger issue. Even in community centers and cafes, people shared the news. The elderly black man who had been watching the scene unfold recounted it to his friends over coffee, his voice tinged with both pride and disbelief. "I've waited years to see someone with the power to stand up and actually do it," he said, eyes glistening. Local news stations picked up the story, with reporters crowding outside the courthouse by late afternoon. One headline read, "Federal Prosecutor exposes bias in courtroom, a call for reform." Interviews with former defendants revealed a disturbing pattern of differential treatment that resonated far beyond that day's proceedings. Meanwhile, in his private chambers, Judge Harris sat alone, his usual commanding presence dimmed. The fallout from Rebecca's stand was immediate and severe. A call from the state's Judicial Review Board had already come through, summoning him for a formal inquiry. He rubbed his temples, the weight of 30 years on the bench pressing down on him like never before. The courtroom, which once felt like his domain, now seemed a fragile throne. Across town, Rebecca returned to her office, exhausted but steadfast. The Peterson trafficking case still awaited her attention, but so did a flood of messages from colleagues and civil rights organizations. One stood out. "Rebecca, we've been tracking these patterns for years, but lacked a voice strong enough to be heard. You've changed that." The following days were a whirlwind of scrutiny and change. Investigators combed through court records, examining contempt fines, sentencing disparities, and treatment of defendants based on race and background. James Wilson, the bailiff, provided testimony that supported Rebecca's observations. "I've kept mental notes over the years," he said, his deep voice unwavering. "What happened to Ms. Turner wasn't new, but it was finally noticed." Reporters interviewed former defendants, many of whom shared eerily similar experiences of bias and unfair treatment in Judge Harris's courtroom. Community leaders called for mandatory bias training for court officials and better oversight to ensure equitable treatment. Judge Harris, once known for his rigid adherence to order, faced an inquiry that would decide not only his future, but the reputation of the institution he represented. The Judicial Review Board's investigation brought to light troubling statistics. Black defendants had been fined more frequently and more harshly than their white counterparts for similar infractions. The data was irrefutable, and the public demanded accountability. Rebecca's decision to pay the fine, to face the system rather than evade it, became a symbol of integrity and determination. It inspired a movement within the local legal community, where more lawyers began to document and report instances of judicial bias. A coalition of attorneys formed to push for new guidelines, ensuring that all defendants would be treated with equal fairness and respect. The state's response was swift. The Judicial Oversight Committee mandated bias training for all judges and courtroom personnel. Procedures for handling tardiness and contempt were reviewed and standardized to prevent subjective enforcement. Judge Harris, unable to defend against the overwhelming evidence, chose early retirement over a public disciplinary hearing. Rebecca's office, now bustling with new cases and initiatives, became a hub for legal advocacy. Her framed $500 fine receipt hung on the wall as a powerful reminder. One act of courage could initiate a wave of change. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom was not the only thing transformed. The trust between the community and the legal system began to rebuild, not through sweeping promises, but through actionable steps and accountability. The echo of that morning's confrontation resonated, a testament to the idea that justice, while imperfect, could be reshaped by those brave enough to challenge it. In the months that followed, the judicial system in Atlanta began to shift in a way that many had not thought possible. Under the scrutiny of public demand and the pressure from legal advocates, comprehensive reforms were put into place. Mandatory anti-bias training was rolled out for all judges and courtroom staff, a series of workshops designed to make them aware of both overt and subtle prejudices that could affect their decisions. James Wilson, once just a quiet presence in the courtroom, was appointed as the head of a new program focused on training bailiffs and clerks to recognize and report discriminatory practices. Transparency became a cornerstone of the new system. A public reporting mechanism was established, allowing lawyers, defendants, and even spectators to submit anonymous reports of perceived biases in court proceedings. The data from these reports was reviewed monthly by an independent oversight committee composed of legal experts, community leaders, and civil rights advocates. The changes rippled through the courthouse, ensuring that fairness was no longer a whispered wish, but an enforceable standard. Court records were audited regularly, and disparities in fines and sentences were meticulously examined. Patterns that had once been overlooked now triggered alerts and investigations. Rebecca's brave stand that morning had set off a chain reaction, uncovering issues that ran deeper than Judge Harris's courtroom. It became clear that systemic change was needed, not just in Atlanta, but in courts throughout the state. Rebecca Turner's office, once known solely for high-stakes federal cases, now became a beacon of reform and advocacy. Colleagues who had once hesitated to speak out now came to her with stories and data, contributing to a growing movement. One afternoon, an invitation arrived from Emory Law School. They wanted her to teach a special seminar on fairness in the judicial system and how to confront bias effectively. Standing before a lecture hall filled with aspiring lawyers and seasoned attorneys alike, Rebecca felt the familiar stir of determination. The framed $500 fine receipt had become more than a symbol on her office wall. It was a testament to the power of accountability and the importance of standing firm even when the path was daunting. Justice, she began, addressing the audience, is not just a concept we aspire to. It's an active pursuit, a commitment we make to ourselves and those who rely on the integrity of the law. But achieving it requires more than adherence to rules. It demands that we recognize when those rules, or the way they are applied, do not serve everyone equally. As Rebecca spoke, the room was quiet, attentive. Many in the audience had read about her stand and its aftermath. Now they listened intently as she recounted the experience, not with bitterness, but with resolve. It wasn't easy to stand up that day, but it was necessary, because change doesn't come from comfort, it comes from courage. Among the attendees, a young black woman took notes furiously, inspired by Rebecca's words. She knew that her path in law would now be focused on advocating for equality, following the footsteps of someone who had shown that justice must be defended from within the system. Rebecca continued, emphasizing that true change requires collective effort. Each one of us has a role to play, whether it's as a lawyer, a judge, a clerk, or a citizen. The integrity of the system depends on our willingness to challenge it when necessary. When the session ended, a line formed, students and professionals alike eager to shake her hand, thank her, and share their own stories. The elderly man from the courtroom months ago came to one of her talks, eyes bright as he watched Rebecca inspire the next generation. Reforms spread beyond Atlanta, with other cities adopting similar practices: mandatory bias training, transparent case reviews, and active community involvement. A new era of trust began to emerge, built on the acknowledgement that justice was an evolving practice, not a static promise. And at the center of this wave of change was Rebecca Turner, a woman who had faced down prejudice and used her voice not just for herself, but for everyone who would follow. In the main lobby of the courthouse, a new plaque was installed, reading, "Justice is not only the law, it is how we uphold it for every person who enters these doors." Beneath it, the date of Rebecca's stand was inscribed, a reminder that one voice, steadfast and brave, can indeed ignite transformation. Thank you for following this inspiring story of courage and change. If you found this story meaningful, please share your thoughts in the comments and spread the message of justice and fairness. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to stay connected for more powerful stories. Let's stand together for what's right and work towards creating a better world.